سلام خانم ها و آقایان، خوش جلمسیز، همگی خوش آمدید. Welcome everyone. On behalf of iBridge's Board of Directors, again I welcome everyone to this program. پرزنتیشنی که شین خواهد داشت به انگلیسی خواهد بود. The presentation will be in English, but you are more than welcome to ask your questions in the second part of the program in English or Farsi or in Mandarin if you know, because Shane is pretty proficient in Mandarin language as well. Without further ado, let's go and see what Shane has brought to us today. And he'll be talking about the global megatrends shaping our new reality. Shane?
Thank you. خیلی ممنون محبوب جان. دوستان عزیز سلام عرض میکنم به همگی شما از سراسر دنیا هر جا که هستید. امیدوارم خوب و خوش و سالم باشید و ممنون که منو دعوت کردید برای این ساعت با شما باشم. چه از خاطرات خوبی از کنفرانسی که در اسپانیا در آیبریجز بودم دارم و انشالله که همیشه موفق باشید. این گروه آیبریجز قدم‌های خیلی خوبی برای ساختن پل‌های دوستی بین ایران و دنیا برداشتن و امیدوارم که همیشه موفق و مؤید باشید. امروز اگه اجازه بفرمایید من پرزنتیشنمو به انگلیسی میدم، ولی اگر سوالی چیزی بود به فارسی همونطور که محبوب جان فرمودن دریغ نکنید و امیدوارم که تجاربی که توی این چند ساله در موردش میخوام صحبت بکنم مد نظر شما باشه و بتونید ازش استفاده بکنید. این مطالبی که میخوام در موردش صحبت بکنم تحت عنوان Global Mega Trends چیزهایی هستش که توی چند سال گذشته شاید میتونم بگم وقتی که من CEO هانیول بودم، CEO اینترنشنال هانیول بودم، به اونا خیلی توجه میکردم و بیشتر دایرکشن هانیول رو از این الهام از این مگا ترندزها گرفتیم و اینوستمنت هایی که کردیم و دایرکشن کمپانی رو که بردیم تو این جهات بود. الان هم که شرکت اینوستمنت خودم رو دارم، این ترایبریج، بیشتر به اصطلاح اینوستمنت هایی که ما داریم توی همین زمینه های مگا ترندز هایی هستش که توی دنیا ما داریم میبینیم و مطالعه میکنیم و سعی میکنیم که درک بکنیم و چیزایی نیستش که من از روزنامه اینا در آورده باشم و بگم خب اینا باید بهش توجه کرد. چیزایی هستش که واقعا خودم در 20 سال گذشته هم شرکت هانیول که یکی از بزرگترین شرکت‌های صنعتی دنیا هستش رو بر اساس اون قرار دادم و هم الان هر روز در این زمینه فعالیت میکنم. So we'll go to my presentation and then we'll try to keep it to like 30-35 minutes or so and then we'll have Q&A. Presentation منو می‌بینید؟
بله بله.
خب so I'm going to talk about mega trends today, and I just want to clarify what mega trends are. And there are these are transformative forces that shape the economy, society, culture, people, businesses, way of living. They transcend through ripples through the ages. And why they're important? Because a lot of people, they build businesses around trends. And I've never been a fan of building things that are trendy. Trends are usually, when you build things around trends, you're usually a follower. At best, you're a fast follower. You're not setting trends. You're not looking at the global. So these are commonly accepted and practiced customs and conventions, popular rituals and habits of the masses, constantly changing by time and place. So what we're talking about is the left-hand side, is megatrends and not trendy things. And megatrends allows you to be thoughtful about real impact for society, real impact for humanity, After all, the purpose of our lives is not just to enrich ourselves. The purpose of our lives is to have an enriched life through service to humanity, through having an impact. And these really can only happen through looking at the big things that shape human society, and that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to talk about this philosophy that much more, just to say that don't look for trendy things in life. Look for those mega trends and see where you can actually differentiate by investing in those areas. So what are some of these mega trends? And I'm going to go through them in no order of importance, because mega trends are like the warp and woof that builds a tapestry of society. Therefore, no one warp or woof is more important than the other. They shape how humanity moves forward. Perhaps one of the greatest megatrends in the past 25, 30 years is the rapid rise of urbanization. Of course, this we could say, this has been a megatrend that's been going on for 10,000 years. But remember that until 30 years ago, more than 70% of the population of the planet were still rural. Today, that has really, really changed. By 2030, 60% of the population will live in cities. Still 40% will be rural. So, but 80% of all of this will be in Africa and Asia. China alone urbanizes 15 million people per year, and India about 10, although the nature of urbanization in one or the other is different. 15 million is 1.5 times the population of Tehran, and China urbanizes that per year, every year. The other big mega trend is aging population. 13% of the population will be over 65 in 2030. This is the first time that this happens in history of humanity. We've never had this happen. It's just because of the technology and the improvement in healthcare and all of that. For the first time, we're going to have a fairly large portion of the population, and 90% of the youth population will be in developing countries. Of that 13% in aging population, more than 70% of that will be in developed countries. So this lopsided development in the East and the West is a big part of it. Global healthcare is a major megatrend. I think COVID-19 proved that all nations are ill-prepared to deal with a global pandemic, and national boundaries prove meaningless in dealing with global health crisis. I had held a lot of seminars on this topic. Just for your information, on January 20th, 2020, I was in Wuhan. I was the last foreign businessman to visit Wuhan. And of course, 3 days later, as you know, the whole world found out about Wuhan and the whole thing started collapsing. So I've been living with this pandemic for well over 2.5 years. So it's really very precarious. The other one, which is a mega trend that people don't talk about it as much, is the rise of the middle class. But this is a different kind of a middle class. This is not the American middle class or the European middle class. They have a different set of purchasing power. I call it the mass mid-segment. 65% of the world's population will be middle class in less than 8 years, up from 45% just 2 years ago. That rise, imagine, it's like snow. It's been cooling the ground for so many hours, and all of a sudden in 2 hours, you see this pile of snow come up. 80% of the middle class, or 4.4 billion, will be in developing regions of the world. Are the companies in the world, are the investments dollars, are the VCs, are the PEs, are the governments ready to cater to the needs of this middle class, which is very different than the American middle class or the European or even the Japanese middle class? If you look at the composition of this disparity of the middle, look at China versus India. Even between the two countries, you cannot compare one with the other properly. China has about 41% that are in the upper middle class. India has only 10% in the upper middle class. China has an emerging 34%, which is actually shrinking. In the mass mid segment, it's shrinking because it's going into upper middle class. India is actually booming in the mass mid segment, which is GDP per capita, which is about 1/4 to 1/5 of the upper middle class. But nonetheless, they still have disposable income. Indonesia will have 40% of the population, Pakistan 40%, Nigeria 25%. All of these countries that are rising in this emerging new middle class, which is about 1/4 to 1/5 of the spending power of Western middle class, but nonetheless, they still have disposable income, they have savings, and they have needs and desires that need to be met at a very different price point, at a very different set of requirements. 95% of the middle class population will be in emerging markets. Well, who talks about that these days? People don't, because they don't realize that that this really is not a Western society dynamic. This is an emerging markets dynamic, but in reality, why the emerging markets were always just emerging? Because we didn't have the middle class in these emerging markets. Today we do. That's why for a long time, for about 10 years at Honeywell, we stopped calling them emerging markets. We called them high growth regions, because we drove about 70% of the growth of Honeywell from the high growth regions in the past 10 years. That's remarkable, because Honeywell went from a $20 billion company to a $160 billion company, went from in terms of market cap, went from a $20 stock price to $200 stock price, and went from almost a bankrupt industrial company to the #1 industrial company. 70% of that came from emerging markets, which we call high growth region, and majority of that from middle class. You can see how the income distribution is changing in the world significantly. In the developed markets, this is how the income distribution is. Look at the disparities of that in the high growth regions in the world. Imagine a company that has pedigree in Germany or in Netherlands or in the UK or in US. How are they really well positioned? And history shows us that they are not really well positioned to take advantage of these dynamics. And I'll show you some other mega trends that shows that the face of competition is going to dramatically change in the next few years. Consumerism is another thing, but consumerism in America and in the West, we may be aware of, but consumerism that is emerging in a place like China, India behind it and all that is astounding. So in America, the size of an average home tripled in the last 50 years. In China, the speed of that is about 6 times the speed of that of the West. And the mass of that is about 10 times. So if you take your physics and say, what is acceleration? What is the rate of change? Is mass times speed. It's about 60 to 70 times faster in emerging markets like China. That means the average person walking in the streets of China feels the rate of change much more than they did during the Industrial Revolution in Belfast or in Philadelphia in the 1800s and 1900s, because it took nearly 50, 60 years to double the standard of living, whereas in China, it took less than 10 years, 4 times in a row. Environment is another major one. The rising surface temperatures, the greenhouse emissions, and frequent natural disasters. There isn't a place in the world where we're not seriously talking about the environment as a major factor in deciding on government policy, geopolitical considerations, as well as investment policy. Global terrorism, I don't need to get into that a lot, but deaths from terrorism has fallen 44% since 2014. But still 60 plus countries experienced more than one fatal terrorism attacks in 2018. So the terrorism index is on the rise in certain places, but on the fall in other places. This gives rise to the need for everything from physical perimeter to cybersecurity around the world. New energy, renewables and new energy are all the rage in discussions now, but that's been going on for the past 10, 15 years. And the consumption is growing the fastest in terms of new energy. China is leading the world, but now it's fast happening in Europe, and followed by nuclear power, which is also still growing areas that we have to pay close attention to. Artificial intelligence, I think you're all very familiar with it. This market is going to reach well over 200 billion in the next few years. North America is leading, but I think China is catching up. But I think right now, if we want to be fair, we may have to flip that and say, perhaps China and North America are leading together, or maybe perhaps China is actually leading and North America is a fast second follower. Because China's policy for artificial intelligence is enshrined within the 5-year plan, and they're investing tremendously in this area. These are some of the areas of applicability of artificial intelligence, of course, in self-driving, drug discovery, smart retail, and now recently in everything from customer service, linguistics, natural languages, even delivery, et cetera, et cetera. Robotics. I think if COVID did anything, is fast forwarded robotics and automation by at least 10 years. I know that for certain in the top 10 industrial companies with which I'm very familiar. But this is an industry that people realize that the more mundane tasks that really were the bottleneck during COVID have to be automated, and robotics is fast on the rise. Many robotics startups in China and India, in United States, in Europe have taken shape. Some of them, some of their founders I know very well. And if it's done well, this is a tremendous area of investment and success. Smart robotics, I won't talk about that too much. New way of transportation, I think from everything from eVTOLs to hyperloops to passenger drones, autonomous vehicle. This is, and all the technologies that surround this in order to make these things happen, from air traffic, smart air traffic management to smart road management system, to sensors, to cameras, to radars and LiDARs, et cetera, et cetera. This is a huge area in the next 10, 15 years. And we're just beginning to touch the surface of this. FinTech, of course, serious changes are happening in the area of FinTech. Crypto is just one area of it, but I think that the global banking systems and global financial technologies are going through a major reform in order to be able to cater to the needs of humanity in the 21st century. Cybersecurity, need I say more? I mean, every single day we hear about cybersecurity. It's already a market that's that will cost more than 6 trillion this year, and it's already a market that is well over 260 billion. Global terrorism, we talked about that. Supply chain disruptions. I think during COVID, you all see, and you were all a witness to the fact that perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing humanity is going to be supply chain. So the world supply chain is very, very complex and sophisticated, but it's also very fragile. Global supply chain risk events increased 36% in 2018. It increased 90% in 2021. And as you can see from everything, if you want to order a car, to order a computer today with Apple, it will take you 3 months. Order a car, it may take you 12 to 18 months. Many car manufacturers don't even manufacture cars in certain lines anymore. You look at chips shortages, look at everything. You look at all the food increases, price increases, all the inflation. Global supply chain is a big culprit at the heart of that calculus. Investment and venture capital. This is really an incredible area of rapid change where a tremendous amount of capital is finding its way into not only these trends, but also into emerging countries, which just the past 10 years was a small portion of it, but China has become the second largest VC market in 2018. And today, more than 30% of the VC is directed to China, even despite the challenges that we've seen in China in the past year and a half with respect to COVID. I'm going to brush over a couple of these. Of course, we had the end of communism, we had the rise of nationalism. By the way, this rise of nationalism has been very interesting because it showed that when the world sticks to national boundaries to protect the national welfare of every country, we are unable to really solve global issues like the pandemic or food security or the environment. And this rise is actually one of those megatrends that are really, really worrisome. The welfare of the whole of humanity depends on the welfare of the parts, but it also depends on the actual collaboration between the nations of the world. And today we have a very precarious situation for that. Rising racialism, both in America and Europe, is very rampant in Africa and rearing its head everywhere in Asia as well. Another major, I would say, headwind in the global megatrends. I want to talk a little bit about technologies that enable future growth. As you know, in every age, we've had these modern technologies that enable. So what are some of these technologies that we got to think about? I think the only way you address them to these major areas of global megatrends. It's either about energy, it's about transportation, or it's about communication. If you look at it, the whole world has been driving on these things for even in ancient times. We innovated in these areas. So if you want to focus your talent, your entrepreneurialism, your money, your investment capital, your career, it's got to be in technologies that transform one of these areas. Energy, transportation, and communication. They then give rise to everything in terms of the environment, safety, security, health, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been the case. So I want to talk about a couple of other megatrends. Megatrends in terms of transformation of the West. One of the biggest megatrends has been that in the past, from the 1300s, when China began its slow but inevitable demise, two empires rose. One was the Ottoman Empire and then European imperialism, but of course, concomitant to that was European colonization and the Industrial Revolution. By the 1980s, essentially the world was a Western world. As you can see, the scorecard of the Western world was that 10% of the world population was rich, about 600 million in North America and Eastern Europe. And most of the world economy, most of the global institutions, nearly all of the control growth on the institutions of the world were Western. 90% of the population was relatively poor, and they were non-Western, and we called them third world. Nobody even stopped to ask what happened to the second world. So we had a big divide, and I would say the report card of humanity was pretty grim. We created all these institutions to make sure that those remain the same. And this is what it was. If you go back, even as far as 1800s, China was nearly 1/3 of the global economy. India was a fairly large portion of the global economy. China and India together were about 60%. But then all of that fell. And by 1980s, really, it was America, Western Europe, and Japan as a provider to America and Western Europe. But things changed. China's rise made a big change in the world. I went to China in 1992. At that time, the real GDP was 1 trillion, was about 10% of US. And it was a planned economy. And everybody said China will flounder and fail. That was a picture of China when I went. Today, it's a very different story. Even despite COVID and the decoupling, it is astounding what China has done in 30 years without following a Western model, creating a digital revolution, organizing, globalizing on a massive scale. And remember, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet economy was only about 7% of the US economy. Today, China's economy is 74% of the US economy. We're talking about a very different force in the world, one that cannot be ignored. And the rise of China has been astounding. And of course, this is not a lecture on China alone, but the rise of China has been astounding. And why do I say China? Is because China is unique in the world. If you look at the Industrial Revolution and what's happened, it took us 100 years first time around to double the standard of living. And then 70, and then we settled on about every 30 to 40 years, we doubled the standard of living. Similar, that's in the UK, similar in the US. Japan did it 3 times in about 10 to 15 years, but for a very small economy, and only in post-World War II. China has done it 4 times, and it's about, if it wasn't for COVID, it would have done it the 5th time in less than 10 years for a population 10 times the size of the Industrial Revolution. It's astounding. It's never happened in human history. That's why in the past 30 years, China has been responsible for well over 70% of the poverty alleviation in the world. We rose 800 million people out of poverty in 350 years. China did the same thing in 30 years. So the speed of change, 10x. And by the way, I don't want to defend China or the West in this thing. It's just facts of what has happened. If you're looking at globalization, where China and the Chinese companies have gone, it gives us a thinking to see the difference in color. Just go back the year 2000. The world was blue and shades of green and European. Today, that color has changed. Has the world waken up to the fact that we have to live in a world which is multicolored and in a world that is actually scaling up in a very different way? Look at BRICS, for example. Even the concept of BRICS is so easy for us to kind of accept. BRICS were the reason. That's not true. If you look at BRICS over a 15-year period or 18-year period since Jim O'Neill announced the conception of BRICS, actually China is about 70% of all the growth of all the BRICS. South Africa is not even a rounding error. India, which is the second one, is 1/6 the growth rates of China, and Russia and Brazil were less than 1/10. So China was actually had a greater contribution to world growth than the United States in that 18 years. So it wasn't really, the megatrend wasn't really BRICS. The megatrend, I named it CREST, China and the rest. And that's why companies that understood that really took greater advantage of the growth in the past 20 to 25 years. And China was a country of maybe mostly copies and imitation, but now it's a nation of innovation, and a lot of innovation is coming from there. A lot of digital transformation and digital giants, and it's a country that has a perfect storm of competition for multinational companies, local HGR countries, the traditional Red Army, the Chinese companies, the non-traditional, and as well as multinationals. That is a new reality, not just in China, but everywhere in the world. The traditional multinational companies that used to succeed aren't going to succeed. When I started at Honeywell, GE was a $360 billion company and growing. Today, they're less than $60 billion and shrinking and dying. Why? Because these dynamics are way too complex for large multinational companies, a lot of large multinational companies. And the next 10 years, this trend is actually accelerating. So some of the leadership lessons in the new era of globalization, I'll share with you some of the things we did in China, and then within a couple of minutes, I'll wrap it up and you can ask questions. So where did I start with the transformation of China? We were really broken and not growing. Because of that megatrend, I said, we need to start in China. Forget about starting the whole world. If you can transform China, you can transform the rest. So in order to transform them, I looked at a few levers. Start with culture. Culture is everything in a company. With people, look at the end markets and the global megatrends. Create a discipline with practical and pragmatic approach. Innovate locally, which is extremely important in today's age, and tell the story and begin to create supporters. Look, everybody wants everything on the left-hand side, but reality is the right-hand side. How do you create a world where these seemingly competing trends are not your reality, that you create new reality? So what we did in China was we aligned our strategies along the 5-year plans of the country. And we aligned them along culture, people, markets, disciplines, and innovating locally. And as you can see, we did localization, we did mid-segment, East for East, meaning innovate in the East, send it to the rest, becoming a local competitor, East to West, serve the world, vertical and key account management, getting understanding of all of the vertical businesses, connected meaning a complete digital economy, and of course, what's emerging is mass mid-segment. These were, to establish that, it wasn't just pick one or two things and hope for the best. Every single year, it was a daily vigilance of creating disciplines of understanding the market and aligning ourselves along these megatrends. The strategies are be local, BCC meaning be local, mass mid-segment, grow in the digital world, create ecosystems where not only you, but everybody succeeds, manage key relationships carefully, and innovate along the new megatrends. My approach and principles to that was that leaders that want to either invest, innovate, do a startup, need to be totally committed. Always wear a new lens, and I'll talk about what this new lens is. Lead from the front. Don't lead from your desk. Start with culture and people. Leverage the whole ecosystem of the world. Build the adventure together. Build organizations that are anti-heroic. Heroic organizations, I have no time for. Build trust and rapport with stakeholders. If you're going to a table of discussions with friends, always have a solution, not just a problem. Remember that strategy is not top down. Strategy is bottom up and link it to the big picture. You can't say, well, the mega trend is urbanization, so let's go transform urban cities. No, we took that, say that's the mega trend, but what's happening in the cities? Buildings are eating up a lot of energy. So we created healthy buildings and smart building solutions within the context of energy, health, and urbanization. Execute with urgency and be apolitical. In business, politics, creating a political organization is really your anti-hero. So traditional lenses was to go for productivity, maximize your return, lead in the high end, pay for performance, maximize margins, and defend the share. Still, a lot of people talk about that. My view is in the new lens, you have to invest for growth. You have to create impact. You have to address the mass and the mid segment. You have to have employment with a purpose. Otherwise, people won't want to work for you. And you have to maximize customer value. They seem to be competing, but they are not. Good leaders can do both. They won't do one or the other. I'm gonna move to universe of possibilities and leave it here as a backdrop page, and invite you for any kind of comments, questions. And these universe of possibilities are really in areas that I talked about: food security, rise of middle class, China and HGRs, global healthcare, supply chain, it's a huge one, AI, digital, global security, environment, cyber, new energy, mobility, you name it, we are in this era of new possibilities. With that, I will take some questions.
Really mamnoon, Shane. Thank you very much. We have some questions in the chat box, but we also encourage participants to raise their hand and ask their questions orally. And let me go to Abe Riazi. Abe asked, what is the implication of Chinese rapid growth and strength for the rest of the world?
I think we could take the approach to look at China as an adversary and as a competition, as a bad competition. But I think it's a very dangerous trend. I think the era of the West dominating all of the institutions and all the economies in the world is coming to an end. It's already ended. As you can see, most of the rising population in the world are not going to be in the West. Let's, instead of antagonizing China, instead of cornering them, China has been the #1 economy in the world for 2,000 years. And it's only the past 200 or 300 years that they have experienced this. And I think we have to have a posture that works with China, welcomes their innovation, as opposed to antagonizing them and making them into an enemy. Wishing that China will go away, or it will fall, or it will wither, is wishful thinking. China is 10 times stronger than the Soviet Union was at its height. And by the way, we're not talking about strength. Let's talk about how can we work with China to solve some of the biggest problems facing humanity, like healthcare, like environment, like global supply chain. So I am of the view, and I see that there are some other questions about whether China is a threat. I don't think China is a threat. They could become a threat if we treat them like that. It could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we want China to be a threat, yes, they can become. I think it would be a shame for humanity to go that route.
Thank you, Shane. And the next question Can technology take authority away from humans?
I think in many ways we are at the cusp of making those trade-offs and those decisions. And in some ways, we've already relegated a lot of our authority to technology, whether we realize it or not, directly or indirectly. Look at a lot of the ways in which either social media or AI engines behind it actually influence our buying patterns, our standards of living, our lives, without us even knowing. We don't even think they're controlling our lives, but in many ways, we have actually relegated a lot of that. The question is a very important philosophical and moral question. I don't think we have answer to it, and I think it's going to develop differently in the West as it is in the East. I think in the East, especially in a place like China, where the population to a large extent through their social contract with the government is accepted to give up certain rights and freedoms in exchange for financial security, et cetera, are gonna give authority to technology much faster, which they have. But even them are thinking, having second thoughts about it. In the West, as I said, there are ways in which we've already given up. So I think inevitably technology will make greater and greater decisions for humanity. The greatest challenge for us in the next 2 decades is how much of that authority, that moral authority, are we willing to actually bequeath to technology? I hope that when it comes to creating moral standards, when it comes to making serious judgment on things, that we don't automate that to a level which is beyond the reaches of humanity.
Thank you very much. We have an oral question from جناب منصور ایزدینیا. جناب منصور خوش آمدید. اگر دوست داشتید بگید که از کجا هستید و سوالتون رو بفرمایید.
خیلی متشکرم از این opportunity از iBridges and also آقای تجارتی. من خودم actually I'm an executive from a Chinese company. I've been in China for many decades also, and my question is actually I have first a comment and second a question. The first comment is that I think a lot of people underestimate the capability of the Chinese, and they think the Chinese just copy this or copy that. Actually, I'm a CTO for one of the semiconductor companies in China, probably one of the largest. And I can tell you that's the farthest from the truth, because I also went to China back in the late 80s, and yes, it's true that the capability on the semiconductor side was extremely limited. But if you compare the capability, ingrown capability in China, I'll put those engineers against anybody in the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so there is this misconception that the Chinese are not capable. That's actually completely false. I have worked with the Chinese engineers for many decades, and I know that just those engineers are very capable. The second, but the question I have now is, so as you mentioned, there is a lot of growth in China, and my question is, how much of that do you contribute to the unique political system within China and the control of the CCP over all aspects of the enterprise formation and the running of the enterprise? In fact, the state-owned companies obviously have a lot of influence, but even the non-state-owned companies and private companies still get a lot of influence from the political system. So my question is, how much of the growth do you think is unique to the political system within China? So thank you so much.
I think, first of all, I totally agree with you when I mentioned that China is a hub of innovation. We filed more IP in China in 2019 than we did in the rest of the world. So I totally agree with you. It's no longer a land of copycats. And that has changed 15 years ago. But most people that were not aware of it. I think a lot of what was going on in China is attributable to the ability of the government to execute. But people think it's because of the planned economy. In fact, the planned economy part really became a backdrop and became much fader, much less colorful 15, 20 years ago, even as early as 1995. But it was actually the planned policies. You see, the strength of China was that they were one united country. There was no debate. There was a lot of debate behind the scenes in the rooms. But when there was a policy created, there was no debate or political interference in that policy anymore. When a policy was instituted, good or bad, the machinery went all out to execute, and China could execute like almost nobody else. So there was a policy, for example, on rapid development of the road system. When I went to China, you would remember from your 80s, China had the road system of 1870s of America. But then rapidly, within 10 years, they built. Of course, there was a lot of corruption in it. There was a lot of mismanagement and all that. But by and large, they built one of the most sophisticated and largest road system in the whole world. Metros, the same thing. There was a policy about urbanization, and they knew that the roads are not going to work out well. So they needed to build all these metros. So yes, they cut corners on environmental studies for them, but they executed. So I think it's not about planned economy or the state-owned enterprises necessarily. It's about the fact that the country had one united front. It was one party. So one united front compared to, say, India, where everything, even after a policy is put in place, is up for serious debate and challenge. And then execution of that policy to almost to a fault. Now, 90% of that was great, but look at it now. I think it's important for us to ask, when a policy is wrong, but you execute it really, really well, it might be just as bad. The policy of zero COVID was great for the first 3 months. Not so good in the next year, disastrous today. But because China had that policy, the machinery cannot do anything but to execute it. So I think their past 30 years is because of the ability to execute against policy. And most of that policy was also run by people who were engineers. I probably know a majority of the Chinese leaders in the past 30 years. I've worked with them. I know them personally. I know them very closely. 9 out of 10 are engineers with master's or PhD degrees. Whereas the same thing is not true in Europe or America, where 9 out of 10 are lawyers. So they actually knew how to create policies about technology and how to create policies about business. The other thing is, within the Chinese government system, in order for you to become a governor or a mayor or a vice mayor or a regional, you have to actually have done multiple disciplines. One of the key disciplines is that you have to go and run multiple businesses within a state-owned enterprises. So Chinese leaders run procurement, run business, run a little township, a little enterprise. Before you can become a governor, you've actually done a whole 360 runaround. So those people are the ones that are in charge of policy. The same thing is not true in the rest. So I think those things give hand in hand, have created a unique dynamic in China, where if they set a policy, they can actually execute it.
Thank you very much. I think you also covered the second question by Mr. Riazi, that he asked, is Chinese rapid technological growth due to access to the West technology and their aggressive reverse engineering? That
no, I think that was 20 years ago true. Mm-hmm. It's no longer true. I think 20 years ago, I have so many stories of reverse engineering and all of that, but I think China's problems itself is so sophisticated that they actually need innovation. And reverse engineering and copying is not gonna solve China's issues. So.
Great. Another question is, will the technological revolution boost welfare or increase inequality?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think the technological innovation does improve human welfare. You look at where we are health-wise today compared to our own parents and our grandparents. All of us have been a witness to a boom in welfare, in human health innovation. But I do think that there are a number of things that are of concern. The greatest one is the policies that allow larger corporations to continue to hegemon over the smaller businesses and to continue to amass unimaginable wealth compared to the average wages. So if you look at it the past 30, 40 years, we've created mega corporations that are bigger than most countries, whereas the wages have and the average masses have not kept up with that. So the Gini index has actually become tighter and more lopsided in the past 30 years, even though we have had 800 million people rise out of poverty. But let's not kid ourselves. That 800 million, majority came from China, from one country. India, even though it has increased its middle class, it's actually contributed to poverty because their poor population has increased, because they've had a population increase in the bottom. And Africa, the same thing. So we have not yet seen global prosperity on a mass scale. We have seen the West with a bad credit card, and we've seen China as the only challenger to that, but we still have 5 billion people that are poor. So, you know, you make your assessment. The second thing is that although technology is great, but we've also entangled human life such that the quality of life may not be as great. Our quality of our friendships, our social interactions, our family lives, our marriages, children, et cetera, et cetera. So I think technology has a lot of impact on all of that. And it's another thing that is a big concern of mine with my own family and I see all the other families, but it's a subject of another discussion.
Thank you. Janab Mehrdad sent his question via chat to me, and he asked me to read for it. It's a lengthy question, so please bear with me. It's in Farsi.
If I understood the question right, a lot of the innovations and all that started with large government policies and were incubated at government institutions and labs and all of that, and then came into the private sector, whether that is a trend that continues or whether that was in China or not. In fact, in China, that wasn't the case at all. For example, so China proved that even in the West, that was the case only in the post World War II era. But that ended by 1980s. In fact, it ended by 70s. So it was only the case for about 2.5 decades. Innovation at the private level, I think, outpaced innovation at the state level already by, although in certain areas like defense, US innovation still continued. But you look at it even in space. Space innovation is now happening at the private level. So in medical innovation is happening at the private level, not at the government level. Environmental innovation is happening at the private level. Government policy helps, but government policy doesn't trump it. So in China, most innovation happened at the private level. Government policy helped, but actually state-owned enterprises were an impediment to innovation versus being the hubs of innovation.
Okay, merci. We have another question by Mr. Ghazi. He asks, let's just face it, China is not the most ethical when it comes to business norms and practices. The Chinese government's support of trending industries have driven many businesses bankrupt worldwide. In the West, however, the notions such as ESG and corporate social responsibility are dominating the business environment more and more daily. In the democratic societies where the governments are not as top-down, competing with the Chinese government or leveling the playing field for the industry participants to compete with Chinese counterparts is almost impossible. What shall businesses do to protect themselves in such business environment?
Well, I don't want to take issue with our dear friend here, but I think this is a narrative that is very popular nowadays in the West to kind of demonize China. Reality is, yes, Chinese business practices are not necessarily the most moral in the world, but neither are business practices of many other corporations or countries. But I would say that the reality is China does not do business the way the Western companies do. It is state capitalism, not pure, if you like, capitalism the way we know it. Capital is a coward. It will fetch the highest return it can at almost any cost. It's the way we've decided to create the capitalist system in the world, in the Western capitalist system in the world. Capital even trumps public policy, even trumps political authority in this country, in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe, where capitalism is in place. China decided they don't want that kind of capitalism. They wanted a kind of capitalism that the political authority rises above capital. You can debate which is better or which is less evil or whatever. I don't want to debate that, but that's the reality. Now we have a dual system in the world. We have a pure capitalistic system with governments that are working, swimming in that, and we have a state capitalist system by China. I don't think the jury is out on how these will interact with each other. The reality is wishing that China will go away or will become Western or will become democratic and all that is wishful thinking. None of those will happen. You have to realize this is a new reality for the world and become proficient in the new world language and compete with China on their ground. We, Honeywell, we did it both in China as well as in places like Africa. Our partners were the Chinese, but we also competed with the Chinese in Africa. But if you're just afraid and you think that they're only going to go there and bribe people and destroy the environment and all that, that's old thinking. Because even the Chinese aren't able to do all the things that they were doing 10 years ago today. Because even those African countries don't want their labor exploited, their environment exploited, etc. You go to Algeria now, 70% of Chinese companies' employees are local Algerians. 10 years ago, that was not the case at all. So the forces of ESG, the forces of globalization, the rise of the standard of living is going to force China to be more of a global citizen. But their business model is state capitalism. Don't forget that. Okay,
couple of quick more questions, and then we'll wrap up in 5 minutes. So, Shane, access to internet world is actually changing our behavior a lot. There's a quote by Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, back in 2001 to 2011, quoting, "The level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming rapidity of information is in fact affecting cognition." What is your reaction to this quote?
Yeah, I think the reality is that a lot of good things have come from connectivity and from internet, and that trend is going to continue. But a lot of negative things have also come, which actually we're beginning to grapple with. The mass onset of ADHD, the lack of reading on one side, the instant gratification that the 15 seconds TikTok and all that give to people in terms of their source of knowledge and information. All of these have actually eroded judgment and eroded social skills on a mass scale, especially among the young population. So I think social scientists and philosophers, leaders of thought are very concerned about what technology and connectivity is doing on the one hand to increase human life and quality of human interaction, but on the other hand, human life and quality of human interaction. So I am myself concerned because I can't say that myself and my children and my environment is immune to it. But the last thing you can do is to become a hermit and say, oh, I'm going to go to this island in a village, back to my own village and say, son, and I'm going to disconnect and live a Puritan life. That's not realistic. We have to find a medium whereby technology can do its good, but I am very concerned about the fabric of society becoming much loosened, especially because people do not read anymore. Their source of knowledge seems to be on their fingertips, but that's not really true.
Great, thank you. I had one last question that I'm going to combine it with Mr. Shapur Hakam's question in the chat box that asked, how can Iran benefit from Silk Road? And my own question was, what is your view for the future of Iran towards these global mega trends that you described?
Yeah, of course, like most of you here, I have great admiration for my homeland and tremendous love for my country, and maybe even a naturally inbuilt bias that we all have. And I'm also hopeful about its future. The thing that gives me hope is the tremendous talent that is in Iran. I think Iran is a microcosm of the world. It's not like some of the other smaller economies or other economies that are single trick ponies. It's not just an oil economy. It's not just a energy or agricultural economy. It's a very, very diverse population of nearly 90 million people, tremendously talented, tremendously under siege today. And if its talent and its potentialities are released and realized, I believe Iran can traverse in about 10 to 15 years' time, really become a significant beacon, not just in the region, but in the world. Perhaps that would take a couple of decades, but I think that there's tremendous opportunities there. When the Barjam took place, we were one of the companies that went to Iran. I didn't myself, but I took the company there to Iran. And because of my belief that Iran is a country that has tremendous hope for the future of humanity, and its future will be assuredly very bright. We managed to build a fantastic business. Our people were incredibly innovative, and within a short period of time, we managed to actually bring in 85% of all the revenues of American companies in Iran in the 2 years that we were in Iran. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for Western companies in Iran, but there's also tremendous hidden talent that is latent and today not really realizing its full potential. My hope for Iran is that it can move in the direction of equality. It can move in the direction of treating all people and all of its citizens with equality. And the world can recognize that working with Iran and in a spirit of fellowship and love can actually bring greater stability, peace, and prosperity to not just to the region, but to the whole world.
Thank you, Shane. I was going to wrap up, but we have a new question. If you briefly respond to that as well, that would be great. Where do you consider metaverse in these mega trends?
I think that there is going to be tremendous innovation in metaverse. I don't yet understand NFTs as much as I pretend to say I do, but I think in the area of cryptocurrencies, in the area of NFTs, and the entire panoply of metaverse, I think we're going to have tremendous new innovation. I welcome it, even though I kind of sometimes feel that I'm a left out generation from that. And I myself have decided to do some significant investment in the blockchain and crypto side of things. So maybe in a year I can answer that question even better.
Great. Shane, before wrapping up, tell us a fun fact about yourself.
Oh, a fun fact about me is that I didn't speak any Farsi until I was 6 years old. I was born in a little village called Seysan, and my parents never even told me about the fact that people out there speak another language, because we were never exposed to it. And when I went first day to school, I realized there's such a thing called a language.
Whereabout did you live that time?
We went to Tehran, and we went to school in Tehran. But I was in Seysan, in the village of Seysan, which no longer exists, unfortunately, after the revolution.
Okay, great. خیلی ممنون شین، خیلی لذت بردیم و thank you everyone. مرسی از همگی که بودید. اگر سوالی داشتید از مجموعه iBridges با آدرس info@ibridges.org تماس بگیرید. اگر دوست داشتید که با سازمان همکاری بکنید، باز با ما تماس بگیرید. مجموعه iBridges داره تلاش میکنه که چپترهای مختلف رو در کانادا، اروپا و جاهای دیگه دنیا فعال کنه. اگر که با علاقمند به همکاری هستید با ما تماس بگیرید و خوشحال میشیم که با هم دیگه راجع به این قضیه صحبت کنیم. منتظر خبرهای خوب iBridges از طریق شبکه‌های اجتماعی به ویژه لینکدین بمونید و جمله آخر رو شین از شما میشنویم و با دوستان خداحافظی میکنیم.
خیلی ممنون، متشکرم از هیئت محترمه iBridges و متشکرم از تمام دوستانی که زحمت کشیدین روز تعطیلی با ما بودیم و به امید آینده درخشان برای ایران و برای تمام دنیا.
خیلی ممنون، خوشحال شدیم و همه دوستان رو به خدا میسپاریم. خدا نگهدار.